They call it the Savage Mountain for a reason. While Everest might be the highest, K2 is the deadliest. A pyramid of ice and rock that demands a blood sacrifice from 1 out of every 4 climbers who dare to stand on its summit. But numbers and statistics are cold comfort when the person vanishing into the whiteout is the love of your life. We often talk about the death zone as a place of physical suffering, the lack of oxygen, the freezing temperatures, the hallucinations. But we rarely talk about the emotional toll of the death zone. What happens when a husband and wife step into that thin air together, but only one comes down? This is the story of August 1st, 2008. It is a date etched in black in the history books of mountaineering. On that bright, deceptively beautiful Friday, climbers from across the globe were lured into the Bottleneck, a narrow couloir of ice beneath a towering serac. Among them were the Norwegian power couple, Cecilie Skog and Rolf. They were experienced, they were cautious, and they were deeply in love. They had conquered the poles and the peaks, hand in hand, but K2 does not care about resumes, and it certainly does not care about romance. In the next hour, we are going to walk in their footsteps. We will feel the triumph of the ascent and the crushing, sudden horror of the descent. We will look at how a perfect day turned into a nightmare that claimed 11 lives and left a survivor, with a memory that no amount of time can erase. If you appreciate true stories of human endurance and the respectful retelling of mountaineering history, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to K2 Stories. It helps us keep these memories alive. Now, let us check our gear, secure our ropes, and head back to the summer of 2008 to truly understand the tragedy of August 1st. We cannot just look at the ice and the rock. We have to look at the hearts of the people involved. In the world of high-altitude mountaineering, you often find 2 types of climbers: the adrenaline junkies chasing glory, and the quiet professionals who treat the mountains with a religious sort of reverence. Cecilie Skog and Rolf were firmly the latter. If you were an American climber in the 50-plus age bracket back then, you might not have known their names instantly, but in Norway, they were royalty. They weren't just climbers. They were explorers in the truest sense of the word. Before K2, Cecilie had already carved her name into history. She was the only woman to have reached the summits of the 7 summits, the highest peak on every continent, to have skied to both the North and South Poles. And right beside her, often pulling the heaviest sled or breaking the trail, was Rolf. Rolf was a bear of a man, known not just for his immense physical strength, but for a calm, steady demeanor that could settle the nerves of anyone around him. He was an entrepreneur, an adventurer, and to Cecilie he was the anchor. They had met years prior, bonded by the shared suffering and shared beauty of the polar ice. And they had married in 2007. K2 was meant to be another chapter in a long book of adventures they planned to write together. But K2 in 2008 was acting particularly temperamental. When the Norwegian team arrived at base camp that summer, the mountain was in a foul mood. For weeks, high winds scoured the upper slopes, and heavy snows buried the fixed lines. Base camp, usually a place of restless energy, had turned into a waiting room. There were climbers from all over the world stuck there, teams from South Korea, the Netherlands, France, Serbia, Pakistan, and the United States. You have to understand the psychology of the wait. Imagine sitting in a tent for weeks, watching your supplies dwindle, your muscles atrophy, and your visa expiration date creeping closer. It creates a pressure cooker. The ambition to climb doesn't go away. It just gets compressed, denser, and more volatile. When a weather window finally opens, everyone wants to go at once, and that is exactly what happened. Toward the end of July, the meteorologists radioed in the news everyone had been praying for. The jet stream was lifting. The winds at the summit were going to drop. A window was opening for the last days of July and the 1st of August. Suddenly, the lethargy of base camp vanished. It was replaced by the frantic sharpening of crampons and the packing of oxygen bottles. But amidst this flurry of activity, there were already warning signs. Because so many teams had been waiting so long, there was a lack of coordination. Who would fix the ropes? Who would carry the gear? Usually, on a mountain like Everest, the Sherpas handle the logistics with military precision. But on K2, the Mountaineers mountain, things are often more independent, more chaotic. The teams held meetings to coordinate, agreeing to pool their strongest climbers to fix the lines up the bottleneck, the most dangerous section of the climb. Rolf, with his experience, was naturally one of the leaders. But even he must have felt the weight of the crowd. There were too many people aiming for the same narrow patch of ice at the same time. The Norwegian team moved up the mountain methodically. Camp 1, Camp 2, Camp 3. On the night of July 31st, the sky was clear. The stars were hanging so low it felt like you could pluck them from the blackness. Cecilie and Rolf were in their tent, resting for the summit push. They were tired, but they were strong. They were climbing without supplemental oxygen, a purist approach that commands immense respect but leaves absolutely no margin for error. However, outside the tent, the timeline was already fracturing. The plan was for the advanced team, the rope fixers, to start hours before the main group to prepare the route through the bottleneck. But due to confusion, missing gear, and language barriers between the international teams, the rope fixing started late. critically late. As Cecilie and Rolf crawled out of their tent, in the pitch black of the early morning, on August 1st, they were stepping into a traffic jam in the death zone. They looked up toward the silhouette of the summit, towering above them. What they couldn't see in the dark was that the Great Serac, a massive, overhanging block of glacial ice the size of an apartment building, was looming directly over the route they had to take. Rolf, always the cautious one, reportedly had reservations. He knew the time was ticking. He knew that on K2, speed is safety. But the pull of the summit, and the presence of his wife beside him, kept them moving upward. They clicked their carabiners into the fixed ropes and began the slow, rhythmic trudge toward destiny. The stage was set. The actors were in place, and the mountain was waiting. To understand why August 1st turned into a catastrophe, we have to look at the geography of K2. There is a specific feature on the Abruzzi spur route known as the bottleneck. It is the most terrifying piece of real estate in the climbing world. Imagine a couloir, narrow gully of rock and ice that shoots straight up at an angle of 50 to 60 degrees. To your left, a sheer drop of thousands of feet. To your right, the mountain face, and directly above your head, hanging like the sword of Damocles, is the Great Serac. The Serac is a massive cliff of ice, hundreds of feet high. It is unstable. It is constantly shifting. At any moment, chunks the size of cars or houses can break off and sweep the couloir clean. To climb the bottleneck is to play Russian roulette with gravity. The goal is to get through it as fast as humanly possible. You do not stop in the bottleneck. You do not take a break in the bottleneck. But on August 1st, 2008, everyone stopped. As Cecilie, Rolf, and the train of international climbers reached the base of this chute, the problems that began in base camp finally caught up with them. The advanced team, tasked with fixing the safety ropes, had encountered deep snow and ice harder than concrete. They were moving slowly. Worse, when the main group of climbers caught up to them, they discovered a horrifying logistical error. The ropes were being laid in the wrong places, and they were running out of line before the most dangerous sections were secured. This is where the alpine-style ethics of climbers like Rolf Bay collided with the reality of a commercialized mountain. Rolf and Cecilie were independent, they knew how to move fast, but they were trapped in a line of climbers who were dependent on those ropes. Traffic ground to a halt. Dozens of climbers were now standing still in the death zone, waiting for ropes to be fixed. The sun beat down, warming the ice, while their toes froze in the shadows. The clock was ticking. In mountaineering, there is a strict turnaround time, usually 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. If you haven't reached the summit by then, you turn back or you die in the dark. But the fever of the summit is a powerful drug. It was here, during this agonizing delay, that the mountain fired its first warning shot. A Serbian climber, Dren Mandic, unclipped from the rope to let others pass or to adjust his oxygen. The details are hazy and he slipped, he fell hundreds of feet down the face. A Pakistani porter, Janbeg, later fell to his death trying to recover Mandic's body. A shockwave went through the line of climbers. 2 men were dead. The day was already a tragedy. Logic dictated that everyone should turn around. The mountain had spoken. But this is the seduction of K2. The summit was right there. It was taunting them, just a few hundred vertical meters away. After the shock wore off, the line began to move again. Upward, Rolf Bay and Cecilie Skog pressed on. But as they climbed higher, past the traversing traverse and onto the final summit snowfields, the lack of supplemental oxygen began to take its toll on Rolf. Remember, climbing without oxygen at 28,000 feet is like trying to run a marathon while breathing through a stirring straw. Your blood thickens, your brain slows down. Rolf was a powerhouse, but he was also a man of immense experience. He knew his body. Sometime in the late afternoon, far past the safe turnaround time, Rolf made a decision that showed his character. He stopped. He was less than 300 feet from the summit. He could see it, but he knew he didn't have the reserves to go up and come back down safely. He told Cecilie to go on without him. He would wait for her right there. This is a moment that breaks your heart in hindsight. Rolf Bay, the husband, watching his wife walk up toward the roof of the world, while he sat down in the snow to wait. He was saving his energy to help her down. He was being the anchor. Cecilie Skog, accompanied by her teammate Lars Nessa, pushed the final stretch. At 5:20 p.m., dangerously, recklessly late, they stepped onto the summit of K2. For a few minutes, the world belonged to them. They stood at 28,251 feet. The curvature of the earth was visible. The shadow of K2, a perfect dark pyramid, stretched for miles across the landscape of China to the north. It was a moment of pure crystalline joy. Cecilie, the first woman to climb K2 while still holding the record for the poles, had done it. But the joy was brittle. The sun was already low in the west, casting long, golden rays that were beautiful to the eye but terrifying to the mind of a climber. 5:20 p.m. is not a time to be on the summit. It is a time to be back in camp for drinking tea. Cecilie and Lars didn't linger. They took their photos, they hugged, and then they turned their backs on the view. The real climb was just starting. As the old saying goes, reaching the summit is optional. Getting down is mandatory. They hurried down the snowfield to where Rolf was waiting. The reunion was brief. There were no long speeches. Rolf saw his wife return safely from the top, and that was likely the relief he needed. But the three Norwegians, Rolf, Cecilie, and Lars, knew they were in trouble. They were climbing down into the twilight. The temperature was plummeting. The ropes, which had been a mess on the way up, were now their only lifeline in the gathering dark. They reached the top of the bottleneck. Below them, the queue of climbers was still struggling, a chaotic snake of headlamps flickering in the dusk. Some had summited, some were still trying to going up insanity at this hour. Rolf took the lead. Cecilie was in the middle, Lars was behind. They moved as a unit, a single organism fighting for survival. They reached the traverse, a horizontal path of ice that runs directly underneath the great serac. This is the most exposed part of the climb. You are walking sideways on ice, with the abyss below you and the ice cliff above you. It requires absolute focus. Rolf moved onto the fixed ropes. He was methodical. He was careful. He was just a few feet ahead of Cecilie. She could see the outline of his backpack. She could hear the crunch of his crampons. It was roughly 8 p.m., or perhaps a bit later. The darkness was nearly total, save for their headlamps. And then, with a sound like the cracking of the earth itself, the mountain decided the waiting was over. The sound was not like thunder. Thunder rumbles. It has a deep, rolling cadence. This was different. This was a sharp, cracking snap like a rifle shot magnified 1,000 times, followed instantly by the roar of a collapsing building. It happened in a fraction of a second. One moment, Rolf Bay was there, a few feet ahead, his headlamp illuminating the path across the traverse. The next moment, there was only a cloud of ice dust and a violently swinging rope end. A massive section of the great serac had finally given way. It didn't just fall. It scythed down the mountain. It swept through the traverse, obliterating the path. And it severed the fixed ropes, the lifeline that held every climber to the mountain. Cecilie Skog stood frozen in the dark. Her headlamp beam cut through the swirling snow, searching desperately for the familiar shape of her husband's backpack. She looked for his light. She looked for movement. She screamed his name into the roaring wind. Rolf. But the mountain gave nothing back. Just the howling wind and the terrifying void where the rope used to be. Rolf was gone. The love of her life, the man who had walked to the ends of the earth with her, had been swept into the abyss in the blink of an eye. For a few seconds, or perhaps a few minutes' time, loses all meaning and trauma. Cecilie was paralyzed. In the death zone, shock is a lethal weapon. It tells you to sit down. It tells you to close your eyes. It tells you that if you just wait, maybe the nightmare will end. But on a 60-degree ice slope at 27,000 feet, stopping means dying. She was stranded. The rope she was clipped to had been cut. She was untethered on the side of the second highest mountain on earth, in the pitch black, exhausted, grieving, and terrified. Behind her was Lars Nessa. In this moment of absolute horror, Lars became the voice of reason that Cecilie needed to survive. He saw what happened. He understood the gravity of the situation instantly. The fixed lines were gone. The route down was gone. Rolf was gone. But if they didn't move immediately, they would be next. He reached Cecilie. We can only imagine the few words spoken in that screaming wind. But the message was clear. We have to go down now. But how? This is the part of the story that terrifies even the most seasoned mountaineers. To descend the bottleneck that steep, icy gully usually requires rappelling down the fixed ropes. You wrap the rope around your device, lean back, and slide down. It is scary, but it is controlled. But the ropes were gone. Cecilie and Lars had to free solo down climb the bottleneck in the dark. Imagine this. You are wearing crampon spikes on your boots. You have 2 ice axes. The wall of ice you are clinging to is as hard as granite and steeper than the steepest staircase you have ever seen. One slip, one catch of a crampon point on your pant leg, one moment of dizziness, and you fall 8,000 feet to the glacier below. There is no safety net. There is no partner to catch you. Cecilie, reeling from the fresh horror of watching her husband die, had to compartmentalize her grief. She had to lock it away in a box in the back of her mind. She had to focus entirely on the next step. Kick the front points of the crampons into the ice. Thud, swing the ice axe, thwack. Test the hold. Step down. Repeat. Kick. Swing. Step. They moved inches at a time. The darkness was suffocating. Above them, higher up the mountain, other climbers were now realizing they were trapped. The rope cutting hadn't just killed Rolf. It had stranded everyone above the traverse. Their lights were flickering like distant stars, confused and panicked. But Cecilie and Lars couldn't help them. They could barely help themselves. The descent through the bottleneck felt like it lasted a lifetime. Every muscle screamed. The lack of oxygen made every movement feel like moving through molasses. The mental strain was excruciating, the knowledge that death was literally 1 inch away. Somewhere in the darkness, they passed the spot where the serac fall had originated. The debris field was chaotic, but they kept moving. They had to reach Camp 4. After what must have felt like an eternity, the angle of the slope began to ease. They transitioned from the vertical nightmare of the bottleneck onto the shoulder of the mountain. They could see the faint glow of tents in the distance at Camp 4. When they finally stumbled into camp, collapsing into the safety of their tent, the physical battle was paused, but the emotional dam broke. Can you imagine that moment? The sound of the zipper closing the tent door? The sudden silence? The empty sleeping bag beside her? Cecilie Skog, the woman who had conquered the world, was now a widow on the savage mountain. She had survived the descent, but she had left a piece of her soul on the ice above. And while Cecilie lay in the tent, devastated, the tragedy on the mountain was far from over. In fact, for the climbers trapped above the bottleneck, the nightmare was just beginning. The serac fall that took Rolf had destroyed the route for everyone else. Above the traverse, nearly a dozen climbers from South Korea, France, Nepal, and Pakistan were huddled in the dark. They had no ropes, they were exhausted, and the serac was still active. Throughout the night, the mountain would continue its work. As Cecilie lay awake, listening to the wind, the radio at Camp 4 crackled with confused, desperate voices. Climbers were trying to find a way down. Some would try the same free-climb descent that Cecilie and Lars had managed. Others would wait for dawn. Many of them would not make it. The darkness of August 1st swallowed the mountain, and as the hours ticked by, the savage mountain lived up to its name in the most brutal way possible. It was a night of chaos, of heroism, and of heartbreaking loss. But for Cecilie, the hardest journey was still ahead. She was alive, yes, but she was still in the death zone. She was miles from true safety, and she had to find the strength to wake up the next morning and walk away from the place where her husband lay forever. August 2nd dawned with a cruelty that only nature can possess. The sun rose over the Karakoram range, painting the sky in brilliant shades of violet and gold. The wind that had screamed like a banshee the night before had softened to a whisper. Looking at the mountain from a distance, it looked majestic, peaceful, even innocent. But inside the tent at Camp 4, the silence was deafening. For Cecilie Skog, waking up if she slept at all meant facing the raw, jagged reality of the world anew. The empty space beside her was not a bad dream. It was the new permanent state of her life. We often wonder what keeps a person moving in moments like this. Why not just lie down? Why not let the cold take over? It is a seduction that many climbers have felt. But Cecilie was a polar explorer. She was forged in the harshest environments on Earth. Her survival instinct, honed over years of crossing ice sheets, kicked in, and she had Lars. Lars Nessa was the unsung hero of this morning. Despite his own exhaustion, despite the trauma of witnessing his friend's death, he remained focused. He knew that Camp 4 was not safe. They were still at 8,000 meters. They were still in the death zone. Every hour they stayed there was another hour their bodies were deteriorating. They had to descend. As they packed their gear, the radio waves were filled with the soundtrack of a nightmare. While Cecilie and Lars prepared to leave, the full scale of the disaster above them was playing out. The radio crackled with panicked calls from the climbers who had been trapped above the bottleneck all night. There were reports of climbers hanging upside down in ropes, of people wandering off the route in hallucinations, of falls, of heroism, and of death. 11 people would die in those 24 hours. Some of the world's best alpinists' legends, like the Irishman Gerard MacDonald, who reportedly died trying to help others, were lost. Cecilie could hear the chaos, but she could do nothing. She had no ropes to give, no oxygen to spare, and no strength to climb back up that murderous serac. It is a specific kind of hell to walk away when others are dying, but the unwritten law of the death zone is absolute. You must save yourself first. They stepped out of the tent and began the descent toward Camp 3. Leaving Camp 4 was, in a spiritual sense, the final goodbye. As long as she was there, she was close to where Rolf lay. Taking that first step down the Abruzzi spur was the physical act of leaving him behind. The descent from K2 is often considered harder than the ascent. Your quadriceps are shot, your mind is foggy, and the terrain between Camp 4 and Camp 2 is relentless. They had to navigate the Black Pyramid, a terrifying mix of rock and ice plates that requires technical rappelling and precise footwork. Usually, climbers are jubilant on the way down. They are fueled by the adrenaline of success. But Cecilie and Lars moved like ghosts. They clipped into the ropes mechanically. They checked their knots. They moved down, meter by meter, in a grim trance. As they descended, they passed climbers coming up from the lower camps, people who were part of support teams or those who had turned around earlier. The looks exchanged were hollow. In the mountains, bad news travels faster than the wind. Everyone knew. The joyous questions of "Did you summit?" died in people's throats when they saw Cecilie's face. The summit's success, the fact that she had technically just become one of the few women to conquer K2, meant absolutely nothing. It was ashes. They reached Camp 3, stopped briefly to hydrate, and kept moving. They reached Camp 2. The air grew thicker. The agonizing gasping for breath began to ease, replaced by the dull ache of profound physical and emotional depletion. The journey down felt endless. It is strange how time distorts in trauma. The descent might have taken hours, but in memory it likely felt like a slideshow of disconnected images. The texture of the rope in a gloved hand, the sound of shifting scree, the blinding glare of the sun off the snow. Finally, they reached the bottom of the technical climbing. They hit the advanced base camp, where the crampons come off, and the walking begins. Down on the Godwinstein Glacier, the world was different. The air was rich with oxygen. The smell of rock and damp earth replaced the sterile scent of ice. As Cecilie and Lars approached the main base camp, a somber reception committee was waiting. The team members who had stayed behind, the cooks, the liaison officers, they stood in a hushed group. There were no cheers, no champagne. When Cecilie walked into camp, the facade of the tough explorer finally crumbled completely. She was embraced by her teammates. And there, at the foot of the mountain that had taken everything from her, she collapsed. The contrast was violent. Just 48 hours ago, she and Rolf had left this place holding hands, full of hope and strength. Now, she was alone, physically broken, and carrying a grief so heavy it seemed to dwarf the mountain itself. Looking back up at K2 from base camp, the summit pyramid seemed so far away. It was hard to believe that a human being could be up there. It was even harder to accept that Rolf was up there, frozen in time, forever young, forever strong, guarding the traverse. The tragedy of 2008 would dominate the news cycle for weeks. The media would analyze the mistakes, the rope failures, the timing, the serac. They would create diagrams and timelines, but for Cecilie, the noise of the media was just a distant hum. The silence of the loss was what was loud. She had survived the savage mountain, but as anyone who has lost a spouse knows, surviving is just the first step. The real climb, the climb of learning to live again, was just beginning. In the years that followed the disaster of 2008, the climbing community tried to make sense of what happened. Reports were written, books were published, and documentaries were filmed. They analyzed the placement of the ropes and the timing of the serac fall. But for Cecilie Skog, the analysis didn't matter. The outcome remained the same. She returned to Norway a widow, but she did not return broken. There is a profound lesson in Cecilie's life after K2, one that resonates deeply with anyone who has faced great loss. It would have been easy for her to hang up her boots, to retreat into a quiet life and never look at a map again, but she didn't. In 2010, less than 2 years after losing Rolf, Cecilie returned to the ice. This time, she didn't climb up, she walked across. She completed the first unassisted and unsupported crossing of Antarctica. It was a feat of incredible endurance, a testament to the human spirit's refusal to be extinguished by grief. She carried Rolf's memory with her across that white expanse, step by step. Today, Cecilie is a mother. She has found happiness again. She still loves nature, though her relationship with the high peaks has changed. She proved that while the mountains can take our loved ones, they cannot take our future unless we let them. K2 still stands there on the border of Pakistan and China. The wind still scours the summit, and the great serac still hangs over the bottleneck, waiting for the next shift in the ice. It is a place of terrible beauty. It is indifferent to our hopes, our fears, and our love. It does not care that it took Rolf Bay, but we care. We tell these stories not to scare people away from the mountains, but to honor the spirit of those who go. Rolf Bay was not just a statistic in the 2008 K2 tragedy. He was a pioneer, a husband, and a man who knew the risks and went anyway, driven by that inexplicable human need to see what lies beyond the horizon. His body remains on the mountain, enshrined in the eternal ice of the Karakoram, in the place he loved most, a guardian of the Abruzzi Spur. Visual note: the camera lingers on a final, beautiful shot of K2 at sunset, the peak glowing red against a darkening sky, fading to black. If this story of love, loss, and resilience on the savage mountain touched you, please show your support for our channel. Here is what I need you to do right now. Click that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. By doing so, you aren't just watching a video, you are helping us preserve the legacy of these brave adventurers. And I have a question for you to answer in the comments below. Do you believe the pursuit of the summit is worth the ultimate risk? Or are some mountains better left unclimbed? I read every single comment, and I want to hear your perspective. Thank you for watching K2 Stories. Stay safe, and we will see you on the next climb.